Shabbat Shalom. This week's reading is Mishpatim. Mishpatim means statutes, laws. And there are many, many statutes, many laws that we are given as part of the Torah. If you remember last week, we were reading the 10 Commandments, and there weren't only 10 Commandments, there are 613 commandments, and a lot of them are in this week's reading. What I wanted to focus on in the short time that we have is the question of slavery. And indeed, the parasha, the weekly reading, starts with slavery. I want to say things, hopefully not to offend anyone, but slavery was always a horrible thing. God did not like slavery at all, ever. But it was a fact of life 3,500 years ago in Egypt when the Israelites were there. It was a fact of life afterwards when the Israelites came into the land of Israel. It's in the Old Testament, the Tanakh. It's in the New Testament. Slavery is still mentioned, an evil that was a necessary evil perhaps at that time. I wanted to talk a little bit though about how the human race has developed in light of this question of slavery. There is a midrash that talks about a Roman senator who came to the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, and he saw something very interesting, that the Israelites do not like slavery, but in Rome, the system was slavery. And the Roman senator came to a very, very horrible conclusion. He said that as long as Judah exists, Rome is in grave danger. The world is in grave danger because the whole world is based on slavery. And here we have these Judeans whose Torah, whose law, whose parental guidance, because Torah does not mean law, Torah means parental guidance. God, our Father, is telling us he doesn't like slavery. And after 6 years of slavery, on the 7th year, you have to release the slave. And any slave that does not want to be released, the slave has to be punished. So basically, the owner, the slave owner, has to punish his slave if after 6 years the slave doesn't want to leave. Because God does not like slavery. Of course, people have to pay off debts, and if a person goes into debt and has to become a slave, then for 6 years the person is a slave. That's the way the Torah taught us. But after the 6 years, the slave must go free. The Roman senator, and again, this is according to the Midrash. This is not a factual story. It is a story that is based on a gathering of evidence from many, many sources. This Roman senator said that in Rome, for every Roman, there were 23 slaves. In Judea, it was the opposite. For every 23 Judeans, 23 Jews, there was one slave. And he said this was an anomaly, and it was an anomaly throughout the Roman Empire. And the Romans saw the Judeans as a threat, because this whole Judean concept, this Jewish concept, this biblical concept of freeing the slaves was a threat to the Roman Empire. I know many of you heard of the movie Spartacus, or the Spartacus uprising of the slaves. And indeed, Rome was built on slavery, and yet God hates slavery. What I wanted to share very much, I don't know how many of you know the work that I'm trying to do to create a political party. I'm trying to create a political party in Israel based on Western civilization and democracy. And what I wanted to add here, indeed, is that after we learn the Tanakh, after we learn the Old Testament, and after we actually, yes, we should learn the New Testament too. We should learn the Quran. We should learn all the books of all the cultures. We should learn about Greek philosophy, because also in Greece, ancient Greece, 15% of the Greek population were free men, landholders. 85% of the population were slaves. So Greece had slavery. The Romans had slavery. And yet we have to learn from the Greek classical culture. We have to learn from the Roman Republican culture, because the Roman Republic was also a form of democracy. Don't forget, the Greeks had democracy. They had different types of democracy. Athens had a certain type of democracy. Sparta had another type of democracy. They were very different, but they were democracies. Rome had a democracy. Then, after Rome collapsed, it was conquered by the barbarians, by the Huns and by Goths and by the Visigoths. Europe went into something called Dark Ages or Middle Ages. After that, something very remarkable happened. We had something called the Renaissance, in which Marco Polo and other Europeans traveled far and wide to bring food and different spices and cultural items that were lacking in Europe from the Far East. And little by little, the Europeans began to open their eyes and to see things that were never seen before. The world started to become smaller. After the Renaissance, we see the Enlightenment, in which people began to learn, people began to read. We had the printing presses coming out in the 16th century. All of a sudden, people could read the Bible, people could read different books. Knowledge began to be disseminated. Then came the American colonies and their revolution against the King of England, King George III, in 1775. The American colonists felt they were slaves to the King of England. They served in the British military. They paid taxes to the crown, and yet they had no representation in Parliament in London. And the famous battle cry of the American revolutionaries was no taxation without representation. And years later, America went through a horrible civil war between the North and the South in the years 1861 to 1865. And one of the prime motivations for this civil war was the abolition of slavery. And what we should look at, I think it's very important today, is that Abraham Lincoln and the North of the United States, the American government, the American people, fought a tough civil war. Southerners had very, very many strong arguments in their favor as well regarding states' rights, but slavery was a horror. Slavery was something that could never be condoned. And it was actually the American people who shed blood, much blood, copious blood, in order to free the slaves. And the Jews who just came out of slavery in Egypt, together with many black people and other people who were slaves in Egypt, we share a tradition of being freed slaves. We understand what the horror of slavery. And one of the points I want to indeed express, very important points, is that there was slavery. And there is slavery still today in Africa, in which the Muslims, we shouldn't, ignore the word Muslim. I know it's not politically correct to talk about Muslims. It is in the Muslim world that slavery has never stopped. For the last 4,000 years, slavery is still a very big thing. And in fact, even certain Muslims enslave other Muslims. I think the worst country in the world regarding slavery is actually a country next to Morocco called Mauritania. Slavery is rampant in Mauritania. Slavery is rampant in many countries in Africa. There's even unofficial slavery in Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries. There's slavery in the Far East. It's not very much talked about. Maybe it's under the table. Nobody really sees it, but it's there. Slavery is a horrible thing. And in fact, one of the commandments we see in this week's reading, Mishpatim, or statutes, is that anyone who kidnaps another person, steals another person in order to sell him into slavery, that person has to be executed. I don't want to talk too much about politics in the United States today, but America has a president by the name of Obama, who comes from a tribe. His father comes from a tribe in Kenya, Muslim tribe, a tribe that was enslaving black people from other tribes and selling them to white trade slavers. And it's a horrible thing that many people don't understand. The President of the United States is a Muslim and that he comes from a tribe of slavers. This is something that our Holy Torah addresses this week about the horrors of slavery. It says 3-4 times in this week's reading, different varieties of thou shalt not kill. Don't forget, last week we read, I think it's commandment number 6 is thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. And here again in this week's reading, we read 3-4 times other variations of thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not strike thy parents, hit thy parents. Thou shalt not curse thy parents. These are capital crimes. The basis of our civilization is based on the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were very, very much expanded upon in this week's reading. Also expanded upon in this week's reading, thou shalt not bear false witness. We had that in the 10 Commandments. It's in this week's reading. It's repeated again. Thou shalt not favor the rich against the poor. Thou shalt not take bribery, because bribery blinds the wise, distorts the wisdom of the wise. And bribery, unfortunately, is something we see very much today. Thou shalt not bear false witness against anyone. There are many things in this week's reading that are very special. They have to be read very, very slowly, very carefully. You have to taste them, you have to think about them, and you have to think about what is God trying to say to us. And I want to emphasize again and again, the word Torah does not mean the law. Torah means parental guidance. The word Torah comes from the same root as Horeh in Hebrew. Horeh means parent. And God is saying to us, choose life, don't choose death. Choose life over death. And if you follow my commandments, remember when mom and dad tell you to do something, usually if they're normal parents, it's for the good of the children. And what God says to us in the Holy Torah is for our own good. Choose life, do not choose death. And very important to keep the Sabbath. God created the world in 6 days. Even God needed the 7th day to rest. Who are we as simple human beings to think that we can work 7 days a week? We have to work 6 days a week. We have to free the slaves, in other words, free them completely. But after the 6th year, free the slaves on the 7th year. Those 7 is an important number for Jews and Christians. And the world today is blessed by the Jewish tradition, or if you want to call it the Judeo-Christian tradition, of no more slavery. And I think, for me, that's the most important message of this week's reading. Shabbat Shalom and Todah.